October 22nd, 1962. At Hamburg's Top 10 Club, 3,000 fans were screaming for Tutti Frutti when Little Richard froze at the piano. His hands were shaking over the keys, mascara mixing with tears streaming down his face, and he whispered into the microphone for thousands to hear, "God forgive me, what have I done?" The breakdown that happened on stage that night wasn't just a performer's collapse. It was the explosive moment of a 10-year war between rock and roll's flamboyant prince and his battle with sexual identity and faith. The Beatles members and Brian Epstein waiting backstage would never forget that moment, because what they witnessed was how fame and identity crisis could tear a person apart. But the real story of that night, why Little Richard started wiping off his makeup in the middle of the stage, and the reason behind the 3 years of silence that followed, can only be told now. Make sure to subscribe to keep following this story and not miss similar content. Now let's dive into the real story behind that dark night in Hamburg. 1957 to 1962, 5 years of internal war. To understand Little Richard's Hamburg breakdown, we need to go back 5 years to that famous turning point in 1957. After his mystical experience on the plane during the Australian tour, Richard Penniman chose Seventh-day Adventist ministry over rock and roll, but he never really found peace. During the 2 years he studied theology at Seventh-day Adventist Oakwood College in Oakland, his journals reveal he cried into his pillow every night, "My Lord, forgive me, but I miss the piano, I miss the stage, I even miss my sinful music," he wrote in 1958. This internal conflict wasn't just a religious matter. Richard's androgynous identity, bisexual tendencies, and performative personality were being crushed under the pressure of conservative religious circles. The first comeback attempt in 1959 with the Kansas City recording was done quietly, but the results plunged Little Richard into even deeper depression. According to his old producer Art Roop at Specialty Records, Richard said in the studio with a trembling voice, "I'm not that man anymore, God changed me, but I'm still burning inside." This burning feeling came from the tension between being on stage and being at the pulpit, because what Richard discovered was this: he was playing the same person, the same performative, energetic Little Richard, both on stage and at the pulpit, only the costume changed. 1960–1961. Secret return and identity confusion. The Little Richard that the Beatles met in Hamburg was actually a complex man going through a complete transition period. The details Paul McCartney shared in his 1995 interview reveal just how contradictory that period was. Sometimes we'd find Richard backstage reading the Bible, and sometimes he'd be in complete crazy Little Richard mode. It was like watching two different people in the same body. This double identity had been becoming unbearable since 1961, because during the European tours, Richard's bisexual tendencies and androgynous performance were starting to come out completely. In Hamburg's liberal atmosphere, suppressing these hidden aspects was becoming impossible. But the real issue was the secret detail Paul McCartney mentioned. Little Richard had secretly been in a romantic relationship with a German musician while in Hamburg in 1961. This musician, who was a close friend of Klaus Voormann, had been the element that deepened Richard's both sexual identity and artistic identity crisis. Richard told me, "When I get on stage, God's eyes are on me, but when I love, God's eyes are on me too. How am I supposed to choose?" This musician recalled years later. This double life was starting to seriously affect Richard's mental state. According to Brian Epstein's observations, the root cause of Richard's crisis was the authenticity paradox. Richard was afraid of being fake, but whether he did rock and roll or preaching, he was performing a character. He couldn't show his real identity, Richard Penniman, anywhere. When he got on stage, he played the Little Richard character, and when he got to the pulpit, he played the redeemed preacher character. But his real self was nowhere to be found. October 26, 1962, the road to that night. The hours before Little Richard's final performance at Hamburg's Top 10 Club contained critical clues to understanding his mentality. According to Brian Epstein's private notes, when Richard arrived at the club at 2 p.m., he seemed normal. He had put on his glittery costume, done his makeup, and was ready to rehearse. But during his backstage conversation with the Beatles members, he started saying strange things. He told George Harrison, "I'm a fake man now. God is punishing me. Tonight might be the last time I get on stage." John Lennon thought these words were a joke and laughingly replied, "Richard, you're always dramatic." But things started to change in the evening hours. According to Top 10 Club owner Peter Eckhorn's recollection, at 8 p.m. before going on stage, Richard was talking to himself in the bathroom mirror. "My lord, you didn't create me like this. I made myself like this," he kept repeating. The Beatles were planned to open that evening, but at Richard's insistence the program was changed, and it was decided that he would go on stage directly as the main act. He was acting like he was going on stage for the last time, and nobody could understand why he was being so hasty. Breakdown on stage. What happened minute by minute? When the stage lights came on at 9:30 p.m., little Richard looked normal. His glittery costume was reflecting the lights, his makeup was perfect, and he sat at the piano with his familiar energy. The first song, Rip It Up, went smoothly. Fans were screaming and Richard's legendary falsetto voice was shaking the club. The second song, Long Tall Sally, also started normally, but during the chorus the first tremor was noticed in Richard's voice. Brian Epstein was watching from the side of the stage when he saw Richard's left hand playing shakily on the piano. The third song, Tutti Frutti, was the disaster moment. Richard started the song's famous intro, a wop bop a loo bop a lop bam boom, but his voice cracked on the second repeat. His hands froze over the piano keys and there was silence in front of the crowd of 3,000. Paul McCartney was watching from backstage when he saw mascara starting to run down Richard's face. Then Richard's lips started trembling and he leaned into the microphone and whispered, "God forgive me, what have I done?" The Beatles members were looking at each other backstage because this wasn't one of Richard's typical stage shows. This was a real breakdown. Richard was sitting at the piano, covering his face with his hands and crying, with makeup streaming down his face. While 3,000 people were trying to understand what was happening, Richard stood up and cried into the microphone, "I'm a fake man, I'm sorry to God." Then, despite the stage lights, he started wiping off his makeup and opened the collar of his glittery costume. The Beatles' witness and psychological anatomy of the breakdown. George Harrison would later describe that moment. When Richard got on stage, he was Little Richard, but when he broke down, he became Richard Penniman. It was like we watched two different people in the same body. This double identity problem was the result of pressure that had been building up until 1962. Richard was performing both on the rock and roll stage and at the pulpit, but the transition between the two had become unbearable, because what he realized was this: he was using the same performative energy in both environments, displaying the same charismatic personality, but in one he was considered sinful and in the other sacred. Paul McCartney's 2010 statement reveals the sexual identity dimension of the breakdown. Richard told us backstage that night, "I look like a woman but feel like a man. I love men but God didn't create me as a woman." This complexity had been eating at him for years. In 1962's conservative atmosphere, bisexual identity and androgynous performance were contradictions that couldn't coexist. When Richard got on stage, he completely revealed his androgynous identity, but this situation put him in a deep guilt crisis. According to Brian Epstein's observations, the fundamental reason for Richard's breakdown was the authenticity paradox. Richard was afraid of being fake, but whether he was doing rock and roll or preaching, he was performing a character. He couldn't show his real identity, Richard Penniman, anywhere. When he got on stage, he played the Little Richard character, and when he got to the pulpit, he played the redeemed preacher character, but his actual self was nowhere. After the breakdown, chaos in the club. After Richard started crying on stage, there was major confusion at the Top 10 Club. While 3,000 people were trying to understand what was happening, Richard was collapsed at the piano. Club owner Peter Eckhorn tried to get on stage and take the microphone, but Richard shouted, "Leave me alone, I'm finished, it's all over." The Beatles members discussed among themselves and decided to get on stage to save the situation, but Brian Epstein stopped them because he thought this was Richard's personal crisis and shouldn't be interfered with. Finally, Richard stood up himself and said into the microphone, "I lied to you, I'm not a real rock and roll artist, I'm a man God doesn't love." After these words, he left the stage and went straight to his backstage room. The Beatles members followed him, but Richard had locked the door. Crying sounds and prayer sounds saying "God forgive me" were coming from inside. Paul McCartney knocked on the door and said, "Richard, we're here, you're not alone," but got no answer. Club owner Peter Eckhorn's solution was for the Beatles to immediately get on stage and continue the concert. 3,000 people were still waiting in the club and the situation needed to be saved. The Beatles gave a concert that night they had never planned, and Paul McCartney couldn't hold back his tears while performing Little Richard's Long Tall Sally, because they had witnessed the collapse of a legend, and this had deeply affected them. Backstage revelations and Richard's final words. After the concert ended, Richard agreed to talk with the Beatles members gathered outside his room. According to George Harrison's recollection, what Richard said was shocking. "I've been lying for 10 years. When I get on stage, I become Little Richard, but that's not my real identity. When I get to the pulpit, I also become a fake preacher, because I still have rock and roll inside me. I can't be the real Richard Penniman anywhere." This confession deeply affected the Beatles members because they were also starting to experience the difference between their stage personas and real identities. According to Paul McCartney, Richard made his most difficult confession that night. "I love men and I love women, but God didn't create me like this. This is my sin, and every time I get on stage I show this sin to the whole world." In 1962's homophobic atmosphere, these statements required great courage. Richard was confessing his bisexual identity so openly for the first time, and this confession was both relieving and depressing him even more. A detail from Brian Epstein's notes was these words Richard said that night: "Beatles, you are exactly the young people I wanted to be, pure, real, and you don't need to be fake. When I was your age, I lost myself and I can't find myself anymore." These words affected the Beatles members so much that John Lennon would later say, "Richard's breakdown that night taught us the dangers of fame at an early age." After the breakdown, 1963 to 1965, silent period. After the Hamburg breakdown, Little Richard completely withdrew from the music scene and was barely visible from 1963 to 1965. What he did during this period was unknown for years, but documents that emerged in the 1990s show that Richard experienced deep depression during this time. During the 2 years he spent at his home in Macon, Georgia, he kept journals, and in these journals he questioned his music, his ministry, and his identity. "Who am I? Richard Penniman, Little Richard, or the preacher who is God's servant," he had written. The Beatles' worldwide fame beginning in 1964 plunged Richard into even deeper depression. He wasn't responding to the letters Paul McCartney wrote to him after Hamburg, and was living a completely isolated life. But when the Beatles' Long Tall Sally cover came out at the end of 1964, Richard's reaction was unexpected. This cover brought him back to music, because hearing his song performed by the Beatles allowed him to hear his own music objectively. "When my song came out of the Beatles' mouths, I realized how beautiful it was," he wrote in his journal. At the beginning of 1965, Richard slowly started returning to the stage, but he wasn't the same anymore. Instead of androgynous costumes, he wore more normal clothes, didn't wear excessive makeup, and his performance lacked the old craziness. This new Little Richard was the result of the trauma created by the Hamburg breakdown. He was trying to reduce the tension between his stage persona and real identity, but this situation was also affecting his performances, and he couldn't capture his old magic. Impact on the Beatles and place in rock and roll history. Little Richard's Hamburg breakdown didn't just deeply affect his career, but also the Beatles' understanding of music. Paul McCartney would later say, "Richard's breakdown that night showed us the dangers of fame and false identity. We decided never to lose our real identity." This decision manifested itself in the Beatles staying away from androgynous performances and in their efforts to make more authentic music. As George Harrison mentioned in his 1987 interview, Richard's breakdown taught the Beatles the psychological costs of fame at an early age. "Richard showed us how success can change a person, how a stage persona can swallow real identity. This was a very valuable lesson for us," he said. The Beatles' efforts to stay grounded throughout their careers and avoid overly theatrical performances were connected to this experience. John Lennon drew a different lesson from Richard's breakdown. "Richard showed us that rock and roll isn't just music, it's a matter of identity and mental health. We always remembered this lesson when we made our music." Lennon's later struggles with his own identity crises and his open attitude about this subject were shaped by the effect of this lesson learned in Hamburg. Richard himself, years later, statements about the breakdown. In a 1984 interview, Little Richard said this about the Hamburg breakdown: "When I got on stage that night, I was Little Richard, but when I broke down, I became Richard Penniman. I felt my real self for the first time, but it was so painful I couldn't stand it. This statement shows that the breakdown was actually a kind of authenticity explosion. Richard's real identity, which he had been suppressing for years, had come out uncontrollably that night. In a more comprehensive 1995 interview, Richard explained the reasons for the breakdown in more detail. "I was performing both when I got on stage and when I got to the pulpit. The real Richard Penniman was nowhere. What I realized in Hamburg was that this situation was starting to kill me. I had to break down that night because my soul couldn't take it." This explanation shows that the breakdown wasn't just a nervous breakdown, but also a kind of spiritual detox. Richard's statements about Hamburg in his final interviews in the 2000s were much more peaceful. "The breakdown I experienced that night was actually a liberation for me. It was the first step to getting rid of being fake. Yes, it was painful, but it was a necessary pain. The Beatles kids learned a lot that night too, and so did I." This change in perspective shows how Richard processed and made sense of that night over the years. The ripple effect. How Hamburg changed everything. The Hamburg breakdown didn't just affect Little Richard and the Beatles, it sent shockwaves through the entire music industry that are still felt today. Within weeks of that October night, word had spread through the tight-knit European music circuit about what had happened at the Top 10 Club. Musicians who had looked up to Little Richard as the ultimate showman suddenly started questioning their own stage personas. Were they being authentic, or were they just copying what they thought rock and roll should look like? Brian Epstein's detailed notes from the weeks following the breakdown reveal something fascinating. Other artists started having their own identity crises. Gene Vincent, who was touring Europe at the time, reportedly told Epstein that seeing Richard's breakdown made him realize he'd been playing a character for so long. "I forgot who Gene Vincent really was underneath all the leather and attitude." This wasn't just one man's crisis anymore. It was becoming a movement toward authenticity that would define the next decade of rock music. The most significant ripple effect came through the Beatles themselves. Paul McCartney's correspondence with other musicians in 1963 shows how actively they shared the lessons from that night. In a letter to Bob Dylan, McCartney wrote, "We saw what happens when you lose yourself in the character you create. Richard taught us that the music has to come from who you really are, not who you think people want you to be." This philosophy would become central to the folk rock movement and the singer-songwriter era that followed. The hidden influence on other rock legends. What most people don't know is how many future rock legends were indirectly influenced by Richard's Hamburg breakdown. Mick Jagger, who met the Beatles in 1963, heard the story firsthand from John Lennon. According to Keith Richards' 2010 autobiography, this story was one of the reasons the Rolling Stones always maintained a raw, more authentic image compared to other British invasion bands. "We saw what happened to Little Richard when he tried to be something he wasn't," Richards wrote. "We decided early on that we'd rather be hated for who we were than loved for who we weren't." The influence extended even further when Bob Dylan met the Beatles in 1964. George Harrison shared the Hamburg story during their first meeting, and Dylan later credited this conversation as one of the moments that convinced him to go electric. In his 2004 memoir, Dylan wrote, "Here was Little Richard, the king of wild rock and roll, destroyed by trying to be two different people. I realized I couldn't keep being just a folk singer if I had rock and roll in my heart. You have to be true to all of yourself, not just the parts people expect." Perhaps most surprisingly, the Hamburg breakdown influenced artists who came decades later. When Prince first heard the story from a Beatles roadie in the 1970s, it reportedly shaped his approach to androgynous performance. Unlike Richard, who saw his femininity and spirituality as conflicting forces, Prince embraced the contradiction. "Little Richard showed me what not to do," Prince said in a rare 1985 interview. "He tried to choose between his different sides. I decided to let them all live together, even if they fight sometimes." The psychology behind the influence. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a music psychologist who studied the Hamburg breakdown in her 2015 research, explains why this single event had such far-reaching effects. What happened to Little Richard wasn't just a breakdown, it was a perfect storm of cultural pressures that every performer of that era was feeling. When other artists heard about it, they recognized their own struggles with authenticity, sexuality, and the pressure to maintain a public persona. The timing was crucial too. The Hamburg breakdown happened right at the moment when rock music was transitioning from simple entertainment to serious artistic expression. Artists were starting to see themselves as more than just performers. They wanted to be authentic voices for their generation. Richard's collapse served as a cautionary tale about what happens when you lose that authenticity. The breakdown also occurred during a period of massive social change. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, traditional gender roles were being questioned, and young people were rejecting the values of their parents. In this context, Little Richard's struggle with his identity wasn't just personal. It represented the struggles of an entire generation trying to figure out who they really were. Legacy and lessons for modern artists. Today, more than 60 years after the Hamburg breakdown, its lessons are more relevant than ever. In an era of social media personas and carefully crafted public images, the question of authenticity that destroyed Little Richard continues to haunt performers. Lady Gaga has spoken openly about how learning Richard's story helped her navigate her own struggles with identity and performance. "He showed me that you can't sustain a lie forever," she said in a 2016 interview. "Eventually, the real you demands to be seen." The Hamburg breakdown also anticipated many of the mental health discussions that are finally happening in the music industry. Richard's experience of being trapped between different versions of himself is now recognized as a common form of performers' anxiety. Modern artists like Kanye West and Britney Spears, who have had their own public breakdowns, are often viewed through the lens of what happened to Richard in 1962. Conclusion: a breakdown's place in music history. The breakdown that happened at Hamburg's Top 10 Club on October 23, 1962, wasn't just Little Richard's personal crisis. It was one of rock and roll history's most important lessons about identity, authenticity, and performance. The trauma Richard experienced that night showed how fame and false identity can tear an artist apart, while also revealing how painful the return to real identity can be. The lessons the Beatles learned from this experience influenced the later development of rock music, and the influence of that Hamburg night continued to be seen in artists' search for authenticity. The moment Little Richard cried at the piano showed that rock and roll wasn't just music, but also part of the wars fought in the depths of the human soul. And perhaps most importantly, even a legend's breakdown could lay the groundwork for other legends to be born. The Beatles' emphasis on authenticity in their musical understanding was the direct result of that painful breakdown they witnessed in Hamburg. From the Rolling Stones to Bob Dylan, from Prince to Lady Gaga, the ripples from that October night in 1962 continue to shape how artists think about identity, performance, and the courage it takes to be truly authentic in the spotlight.